of all, I just want to also say thank you. Thank you for this conversation. Thank you for your leadership, and thank you for your partnership. And I also want to extend my deepest gratitude to Pepper and all that she has done and continues to do to elevate many of these important insights. Uh, I am the president and CEO of Creating Healthier Communities, and we're an organization that's been around for nearly 70 years. Our mission is to ensure that every person in every community has an opportunity to live their healthiest life. And what we know is the fact that depending on where you live in this country, has huge implications in terms of exactly how long you live, and that there's huge overlaps in terms of some of these social drivers of health by race, by geographic, and other inequities. And we're literally on a mission to close those gaps. We have an amazing network where we actually sit at the intersections of business, nonprofits, and communities. And we're leveraging all of those different sectors because it really will require a multi-pronged approach to address these inequities that we actually see. So I'm really excited, not just for the work that we're doing as an organization to elevate the community voice, to elevate those lived experiences, to align and better integrate the lived experiences to many of the social structural inequities that we've experienced in the past in a way that can accelerate the pace of change, because we're actually at the community level elevating significant scalable solutions while also touching nearly 5,000 nonprofits to ensure greater sustainability of these interventions.
In which communities are you the most advanced in your efforts so far versus new ones you're bouncing into, Gene?
So that's an excellent question. So we're doing a lot of work, particularly around addressing the maternal health crisis in this country. We have a major initiative called the Black Birthing Initiative, where we're actually working with pregnant mothers across the country to ensure that that their experiences, particularly with being pregnant and engaging with the healthcare system, is done in a way that is equitable to reduce many of the outcomes that we've seen, particularly facing Black women. We are currently in Cleveland. We are in Detroit. We're in Indianapolis. We're in Atlanta, doing a lot of this work with many of our partners, both in terms of screening, both in terms of education, as well as looking at exactly what are the challenges facing many communities as relates to maternal health, and how do we build the right infrastructure that is community-led to ensure that we are addressing the maternal health crisis facing this country. On one hand, I'm not surprised. But at the same time, I think it presents us with a unique opportunity. And when I say I'm not necessarily surprised, I think that if you might recall, when we went through the pandemic, there was this guidance that said you need to be you need to socially isolate. And I remember saying, no, actually, what we want to do is physically isolate, but stay socially connected. And I think over time, polarization, particularly in the US, and the Edelman report has demonstrated this, that there's been significant levels of distrust by institutions. And I think what's very interesting by the data that you just shared with us, Maury, is the fact that the percentage of people who say that they interact with different races. And I think that is really startling to me, because what it's saying is that we're becoming more and more segregated as our society becomes more and more diverse. So how do we start to become more socially connected? And how do we take the time to get to know someone who looks different from us? Mm-hmm. And it has to be an intentional act. And I think what's happening here is the fact that because of the polarization and a range of other factors, the pandemic demonstrated clearly that, African Americans, Hispanics, Native Americans in particular, were disproportionately impacted by the pandemic for a variety of reasons, including racism, including systemic inequities, that we as a society need to become more intentional about ensuring that whatever we do from a policy, from a business, from a programmatic perspective, that we're elevating the voices. And I think Pepper or someone mentioned this earlier, that it can't be passive representation. It has to be very intentional and active representation at the table to ensure that as we are designing new policies, practices, programs, that those lived experiences are being embedded in what we're actually doing. But I think what startles me is the fact that the percentage of people who say that I don't interact with anyone that doesn't, that looks different from who I am. And if you're
Yeah.
talking about 60%, that we have some work to do. Just add a couple of points to that.
Yes.
Pepper, well said. You know, when I look at that meme, the first thing I think about is the fact that for any parent out there who's had to drop their kids off at school, what's so interesting about those observations and those interactions among kids is the fact that they play with each other. Yeah, if you put a couple of kids together, they will play with each other. So it's what the grandmother of Juneteenth mentioned in her interview earlier this week, that you have to teach people to hate.
Yeah.
And if you teach people to hate, then you have an
Yeah.
opportunity to teach them to love. Because I, it's interesting how kids, small kids, can get together and interact and engage. So that means that there's something about some messages we're sending out there to foster this level of divisiveness, rather than fostering an opportunity to engage with each other. The other thing I'll just mention is the fact that Edelman just did an amazing presentation for our board and our executive team earlier this week, and I was looking at business and racial justice. And it's exactly what Pepper just mentioned. One of the key starting insights that came out of this particular report was that 61% of executives of major businesses indicated that they were uncomfortable talking about race or racial issues with people who didn't look like them.
Yes.
And that they were worried in many cases of saying something wrong, or in some cases coming across as being racist.
Yes.
So I share that to say that if we're going to make some movement in this, in trying to address these issues, we have to be, again, intentional and focus around it and just put it on the table, and then start to have those conversations, and then to think about exactly what does that mean for us to move forward. And what was interesting about the data from Edelman was that there was this huge gap between what CEOs said that their organizations were doing to address racial justice and what the associates in those organizations were saying that the companies were actually doing. So in other words, CEOs and executives think that they're doing more than what associates in their same organization think that they should be doing, right?
Yeah.
So we really have to start to close these gaps. And I think part of this being intentional. If we can't have these conversations, if we can't be honest and candid about how does this show up, you know, how is it possible that there's this huge wealth gap? Excellent question. So what, two things. I have several, but I'll try to be very, very brief, more because you just kind of sparked something here. One is the fact that Dr. King said this best, that, you know, the civil rights movement was also not just about race, it was about economic justice. And what he said was the fact that, you know, this idea of pulling yourself by your own bootstraps is equivalent to basically tying a person leg and then saying, go run the race, right? Meaning the fact that there's a difference between equality and equity, and that these structural inequalities, whether it's redlining or other forms of inherent or unintended consequences of discrimination, really put certain groups further behind, even though that they're willing to run the race. But the hurdles that African Americans have had to jump over has been much higher in many ways for many of the things that we're talking about. The second thing I would say is that I'm a big fan of John Grisham, not Grisham where I am, but John Griffin. And he wrote a book called Black Like Me. And John, for those who don't know, was a white male who changed his pigmentation to really try to understand what it was like to be Black and Black male in the United States. And he talks about an example where he went to the polling station to vote. And this was when there were poll tax. And the person there said, you know, tell me who the last presidents were for the United States, starting with George Washington. So John was able to do that. Then they said, oh, okay, I want you to read this to me and let me know what it says. And what the poll worker did was give him something to read in Chinese. And John looked at it and said, oh, I can read this. And the poll worker was surprised, said, well, what does it say? And John said, well, it looks like I won't be voting today. These are actual examples of things that actually happen. And that has huge implications, right? So in terms of redlining, in terms of the huge gap, in terms of wealth, I think, again, it gets back to how do we start to identify those huge barriers in a way that can really accelerate the pace of change. On the wealth gap side, is it baby bonds where that we're ensuring, like Connecticut, that kids who are born in Connecticut have some form of a savings account that accumulates over time that they can tap into by the time that they're 18 to utilize for college or other mechanisms. How do we start to really close those gaps? Because what tends to happen is the biggest transfer is inheritance. And why is it that when you look at domestic workers, a certain percentage of those domestic workers disproportionately are Black and brown? Why is it by occupation between white collar versus blue collar? You see in certain different segmentations. So we can kind of go down this path, but I think the key point here is that in order for us to address these inequities, we're going to have to look at the long-term implications of redlining, other policies that intentionally or in some cases unintentionally disproportionately impacted Black Americans in order for us to elevate the playing field to ensure greater equality. The microaggressions of that, when it comes to constantly having to counter those stereotypes or constantly having to be in fear of me being an African-American male, having to be in fear if there's a police officer driving behind me. I have to do certain things. I have to make sure that my hands are up. If I get pulled over because I was either driving too fast, I need to say, officer, I'm going to take out my wallet now. Is that okay? I mean, there's all of these things you go through. Will I be able to see my kids? Will I get home safely? You just never know. And I think those are lived experiences. And I think Pepper is absolutely right. I won't have time to say where I went to school or what my pedigree or credentials are. That doesn't matter, but it is a reality. And I think those realities translate itself into why we're seeing so many different health disparities because of the toll of that. High blood pressure, hypertension, all of that impacts you. And we know that. It's called weathering. Deloitte did a study that said that health disparities in the US was roughly about $320 billion in 2021. Think about that. These disparities in health that are root causes because of what Pepper just mentioned and the structure inequities that we have to encounter on a day-to-day basis cost the US healthcare system $320 billion. That doesn't just impact African Americans, that also impacts white Americans and everyone in between, right? So I think as we're having these conversations, and one of the things I've been pushing for is that we have to get out of this narrative, it's us versus them, or that, oh, they are the, no, you're suffering. These inequities impact everybody.
Absolutely.
Impacts everybody. So you're just as, there's an equal interest, if you will, Murray, and other populations solving these, because it has huge implications for them, whether or not it's direct or indirect. So one of the things is in our name as an organization in terms of creating healthier communities is that we really do need to think about communities more broadly, and your data actually it has illustrated that. We're seeing greater social isolation, greater loneliness at a time where we should be more socially connected. So how can we as an organization start to bring different communities together to start having these conversations, to break bread together, to understand that there are common elements of our humanity that are important. The ability to be able to eat, the ability to be able to work, the ability to be able to have a safe environment, the ability to be able to accumulate the range of opportunities that one seeks. However, we know that that's not the common reality, particularly for Black Americans. So how can we start to intentionally have these conversations? And in many ways, I don't know if anyone ever saw them crash, have these crash moments, right? How do we start to have these crash moments where we're intentionally bumping into each other and saying, okay, now I'm forced to see you. And to the point that Pepper said, I want to understand your lived experience. It's not intended to be punitive. It's intended to fully understand that person's lived experience in terms of who they are as an individual.
So you can put the other person not on a defensive posture, but in an empathetic to truly champion the humanity that we both share.
Well, I think the other aspect of this too, and I'll be very quick, I think there's a difference between allyship and co-conspirator. And I just saw this amazing professor talk about this when the murder of the churchgoers in South Carolina happened. There was a young Black girl who was going up the pole to bring down the Confederate flag. There are some police officers there right around the corner, and they said, oh, we're going to tase the pole. And there was a white male who overheard what the police officers were going to do. So what he did was he put his hand on the pole. Just that small gesture prevented the police officers from actually tasing, right? Oftentimes people say they're allies, and I think we need to get away from allyship, don't get me wrong, to being co-conspirators. So it's more than empathy. Businesses have an important and significant role to play. And I think it's both internal and external. First of all, with your workforce. I think that businesses, and especially what we've seen from the Edelman report, there's a huge gap between what CEOs and executive team members think they're doing relative to what their workers think they should be doing. So I think that there's a significant amount of opportunity to really think about how you close those gaps. When we talk about equity, what does that look like in terms of who's getting promoted? What does that look like in terms of the salaries increases? What does that actually look like in terms of who's sitting on the board level, who's sitting in the C-suite? What's the pipeline succession planning? So employers have to be very intentional, both about creating that culture of inclusion and also being very clear about what does that look like as relates to the business operations. That also feeds externally in terms of exactly your shareholders and your stakeholders. Employers have a significant role to play in closing these gaps. Someone said this so well, that you can't assume that what is happening in the broader ecosystem doesn't impact your workers. So we have a lot of work to do, both in terms of creating the space for these conversations within our organizations, and then not just creating the space to talk about it, but also doing something about it. And that is tangible, and that is, you can track and monitor. Appreciate this. So I'm at the stage now as a leader where I'm challenging my peers and my colleagues is to really go beyond what they say to what you're actually doing. What those are, because the actions seem so much louder than what you have to say because there's been so much conversation. And I think we got to go from conversation to action. So what does that look like? My previous CEO did something that was very innovative at AARP. She told her entire executive team that I want you to mentor, sponsor someone who doesn't look like you. My sponsor, my mentor was the COO, white male from Boston. And we have developed such an amazing relationship over the last 4 or 5 years. Think about that.
Yeah.
You know, so
I love that. I love that.
So I think as leaders, we need to be, again, intentional.
It speaks to the intentionality of the bigger issue that you're trying to create.
Yeah.
You're not trying to get your numbers to look like this. You're trying to get people to see each other as people.
So that's just one action. I think the other action is the fact that take the time to meet with, learn from, or view something that totally is contrary to your world currently. It gets back to that data point that you showed earlier, right? How do we get people to engage? It might be going to a play. It might be going to a community event. It might be a range of things, but I think that they're at an individual level. We also have a responsibility to learn about a population that's totally different, or a community that's totally different from our own worldview. So those are the two things that I would offer. Then I think the last thing is the fact that we economically cannot afford not to address this issue.
Yeah.
It's not just about Black people, right? Yes. We got to get to a place where everyone understands that, you know, what would it look like? What would our futures look like if we had an opportunity to ensure that everyone has an opportunity to live their healthiest, most productive life? How do we create systems and processes and practices where the goal is not to jump over a hurdle, but to ensure that there's not a hurdle to begin with?